Hello and welcome to Reimagining Cyber. I'm Rob Aragao, and today I'm welcoming our first guest for 2025, Dr. Andrew Reeves. Andrew operates out of the University of New South Wales Institute for Cybersecurity, and he's an expert in cyber psychology. His groundbreaking research includes the first national baseline study on mental well-being in the cybersecurity sector. We first spoke in episode 127, and there was so much interest in the episode that we've asked Andrew to come back and join us again. Andrew, last time we talked about the three critical human dimensions in cyber psychology: the target, the attacker, and the defender. But today I'd like to delve deeper into your research. Did you compare the stresses and strains put on cybersecurity professionals to those in other fields?
Yeah, and so that's sort of getting to the defender piece there, because we have done that from the perspective of the good guy. So, you know, there's many industries at the moment, I think, that are struggling a little bit in terms of their mental health. And cyber is one as well. Really early on when I was involved with Cyberminds and doing some research with them, from being in the industry ourselves and also from the conversations we were having with particularly CISOs, but SOC teams as well, they were telling us that the focus on the skills issue in cyber that we hear about a lot, they were telling us that was being directed in the wrong place. From their perspective, it wasn't an issue of, oh, we can't get enough people to come in to the industry, or we can't train enough people through our universities, or whatever it was. That was part of it. But they said the real problem was holding on to people once they actually entered the industry, because they were seeing that people would be attracted to the cybersecurity industry, if we can call it an industry in itself, for all sorts of different reasons. They would get into it, and then they would find that they weren't appreciated for what they were doing. They were often seen as just the person saying no. You know, someone would want to deploy some new tool to the market that they thought was really useful, and it would be the cyber team that would say no, or would at least slow down the process. So they were seen as the bad guy. But then, of course, when an attack actually happens, they were blamed for saying, and people would say, why didn't you fix this? Why didn't you do that? So they're in this really difficult position where they are, expected to secure tools that they don't necessarily have a huge amount of control or authority over. And then the work they do is incredibly hard, but not many people necessarily appreciate that. And so coming to your question around what's the difference between other industries, that was a study we did really early on. We compared cybersecurity professionals to a baseline of burnout at work in Australia, but we've now extended that to the UK, the States, and a couple of other countries. And we compared them across a few different metrics. Particularly metrics that were all to do with burnout. And one of the metrics was looking at how their sense of cynicism about their work, so how much they think that what they're doing is worth doing, and also their professional efficacy, which is how good they think they are at the job. And both of those were really low in comparison to the rest of the sample that we had, that was for people across lots of different industries. And we then dived a bit deeper in interviews, and what people were saying was, you can be in a very difficult job, but there are certain things that help prevent that difficult job from causing a mental well-being issue. And one of them is simply knowing that the people and the teams around you appreciate the hard work you're doing. And that's what was completely missing in our sample. And to use an example that we compared them to frontline healthcare workers. We weren't at all expecting that the rates of burnout would be higher for cyber professionals than frontline healthcare workers, but we just thought it would be an interesting comparison. But we did actually find that the rates of burnout were higher in our sample than they were for frontline healthcare workers. We don't believe that that's because the job's necessarily harder. We think it's because those supports and the appreciation aren't there, and so it's leading people to burn out.
I mean, it's really interesting to draw that comparison to frontline workers and the burnout, as you discussed. I mean, it's a bit shocking in a way, but I think when you kind of call out those specific elements of it's real, right? The lack of appreciation, and it's a very difficult work to be in because you have to be right, all the time. We talk about that as a phrase where the attacker can be right once and it wreaks havoc through the organization, and it's pointed back at you or the team in the SOC, as you mentioned earlier. So it's difficult,
Yeah.
right? And there's aspects of that tie into obviously the mental aspects of negative outcomes, and it's unfortunate to hear about. One of the things, Andrew, that I think if you're willing to share would be beneficial for the audience to hear is, you've done a lot of great work working with individuals and helping them kind of get through these walls at times, and and clearing their minds, if you will. Is there an example of, and I don't need obviously a person's name or anything like that, but just an example of someone who you've worked with that you could share kind of that experience? That'd be helpful, I think.
Yeah, so there is an example that comes to mind. Back at Cyberminds, there was a particular ambassador of our work, and the reason he was so keen to promote what we were doing at Cyberminds is because he'd had a very particular experience himself. So he's, career cyber professional. He had worked as a CISO or some sort of similar type function before CISO was the term, for 20 plus years, and had experienced a situation where he was I believe it was during COVID, so I think he was on a Zoom call, and I believe he was talking to the board, and he was reporting about some ongoing situation, some sort of critical but not quite, business is over type of situation. And he was, of course, getting all these very pointed questions from the board. And it comes back to what I was saying before about how, they can be very hesitant to provide resources, but then they blame you if anything goes wrong. And he experienced a panic attack during the meeting. Now, I think with panic attacks, we tend to picture a manic type episode, frantic, but often panic attacks aren't like that. Panic attacks can be a freeze response. And that's what he experienced. So he shut down. He could still he could see them asking questions. He could vaguely still hear them, but he couldn't respond. And it was in that meeting then he decided, I'm out, I'm retiring, I'm done. And so he did. He now does, he still works in the industry. He's a great ambassador for Cyberminds, and he's appeared on the project for us, and he's a great guy. But I think that's just a perfect example of the risks that we run if we don't address this, because someone with that level of experience, that level of expertise, that level of influence leaves the industry. We lose all of that. There are, as you would know, and as a lot of your listeners would probably know, so much of what we do in cyber, particularly around the management aspect, is not written down anywhere and can't really be written down anywhere. And it involves skills of encouraging certain things to happen, and managing the other managers, managing the other executives. That is very difficult to learn and takes a lot of time. And we lose all of that. All of that tacit knowledge disappears when someone leaves the industry. And that's what we're seeing across the board. We see it for CISOs like him who'd been in the role for more than 10 years, et cetera. And we see it for brand new grads as well, who come out of their training, spend a few years in the industry, really hone their skills, really get good at what they can do. Say if they go into a SOC, right? They first year out, they're following the process, and then 3 years out, they have really developed some great intuitions about what's normal and what's not, and then they leave. And we're back to a fresh grad as well, because these people have transferable skills. They're gonna go to an aligned industry, still working in IT to some description, but just not work in cybersecurity, because why would they? They're not being thanked for what they do. So, I think it's a good example. But to answer your question about what can people actually do, I think it comes back to those things I was saying before. I mean, this isn't necessarily an individual problem. All right, this isn't something we can point to and say there's something quote unquote wrong happening in that person's brain. It's actually a very adaptive and normal thing to do, to respond to a situation where the cards are stacked against you and say, no, I'm out. As from a broader organizational and national security perspective, that's not a situation that's sustainable. If we can't encourage talent to stay in the industry, then we're going to be in a real trouble.
Indeed we will be. You just reminded me of an episode that we did. I forget now in timing, but there was a chief security officer. It was a previous role that he was in. It was a very large luxury retailer, and he shared kind of a similar situation, not to the level of a panic attack, but it was more about, he was always discussing what the need for investment was, with the reasoning behind it that impacted the business, right? So doing it the right way and how he communicated that need, and getting, a portion of what the ask was. And then when something occurred, and he was put on the spot as to why couldn't this have been, prevented? He was explaining the situation from previous asks. And it came to a point where basically he was almost feeling like worthless in being able to do the job. When in reality, examples you were sharing, not at all, right? Doing all the right things. And at the end of the day, everyone is a human being. And so, then he discussed kind of how that negative experience, then he was able to shift into and turn into a positive experience for future opportunities for himself. And he's been doing very, very well. So it's a tough situation. It's a tough industry, as you've been sharing. I guess the last ask I have of you is, where could our listeners go? Are there certain kind of online resources you would want to point them to? And we'll absolutely include whatever you have to share in the show notes, of course, as well.
Yeah, a couple come to mind. So if you're interested in learning more about the deception and active defense stuff, I'd really recommend visiting the website for the Uni of New South Wales Institute for Cybersecurity. There's some great documents and resources up there. For the mental health in cyber perspective, cyberminds.org, I would recommend going to. I believe they still put out some free materials that you can download, and they're really useful. For the target, there's plenty of resources available. I used to be part of a research group back in the University of Adelaide that was part of the Defence and Security Institute. So if you jump onto that website, there's some resources there. So, but it's still to some extent, all of these things are still unanswered questions. There's still a lot more research that needs to be done. So if there are organizations interested in helping us do this sort of research, I'd really love to hear from them.
Excellent. Well, they'll have that information to how to contact you also within the show notes, Andrew. Thank you so much, seriously, for coming on today to shine the spotlight on something that we don't talk enough about, right? And we know the reality of these things are unfortunately negatively impacting human beings in our industry of cybersecurity. At times can be very, very, very difficult to discuss, but hopefully this helps someone out there that's listening and realize that there's a path to being able to improve themselves in how they deal with these types of situations, and maybe some of the resources they can refer to afterwards will also help them. So again, we truly, truly appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Rob. It's been great to be here.
Thank you.
Hello, producer Ben here, and just in case you haven't listened to Dr. Reeves's previous appearance on the podcast, trust me, it is well worth a visit. Here he is talking about the psychology of an attacker and how that can be used against them.
So when they enter a network, they won't necessarily go through what the quote-unquote rational path is to get to their target. Instead, they will tend to go down what they feel most confident in exploiting. What they feel most likely is to succeed based on their own experience, not actually based on any objective truth of whether that truly is the most likely path to succeed. It's just the one they think is. And in one of the experiments we've been running, you can observe that behavior through a network and use it to put things in their way by picking up on those things that they look at and go, that's interesting, I'll go down that route.
That's in episode 127, aptly titled Cyber Psychology, Turning the Tables on the Attacker. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Our latest listening figures show that we have doubled the number of followers to the podcast over the past 12 months. So a big thanks to you if you're one of them. If you're not, please take the opportunity to follow or subscribe to the show. Goodbye.